arguably the worst fire disaster in U.S. history. And wanted to talk a little bit about our experience being out there and what we saw with regard to use of PPE, health and safety of the firefighters, but then quickly pivot to why are we seeing this and a lot of the research that we have been doing on sort of barriers. The problem is, again, we have standards, right? But no standards, policies have been established that effectively mitigate the risk. And the reason I say that, and we could talk about NFPA 1984 and everything else, the reason I say that is because simply nothing quite substantial is being done for our firefighters on these incidents. So until that happens, I think we can safely say, look, the standards just don't exist because they're just not being implemented. They're not being used on these major incidents. Most firefighters are still wearing a bandana. That is not a respiratory protection device. Although most firefighters think that it does provide respiratory protection. And yeah, ash soot, and we could talk about all of that, but basically it's not a protective device. And they are working in some of the most toxic, hazardous, carcinogenic environments imaginable, especially when we transition. And I heard somebody talk about it, Dr. Orman talk about, the organic smoke coming off of, a traditional wildland fire. First of all, there's no good version of smoke. It's all bad. It's just different layers of bad. And when you move into that wildland urban interface environment, it becomes just so much worse. I will say too that when we have structures, vehicles, infrastructure all burning at the same time, it complicates things because do we treat it as a wildland fire or are we treating it as a structure fire? Because if it were a structure fire, we'd be wearing SCBAs, right? But we're not. And you know that inside that garage, there's a Tesla that's on fire, that's burning, and it's got the battery pack and everything else. This is the absolute worst case scenario of what could be, occurring on a fire. The devices haven't been, and Dr. Orman mentioned this earlier as well, is they haven't been certified for have been submitted for certification under NFPA 1984. And part of the reason was, and NIOSH did a study on this, a lack of perceived market. I'll tell you what, talk to any wildland or any firefighter who has to deal with urban interface fires, and they will say, we absolutely want a protective device. So there is a market for this. But as we talk about the LA fire siege, I bring these images here because let's make it abundantly clear. This was a 9/11 scale exposure incident for every first responder on that fire. Absolutely. Right? We need to be clear about that. And we need to be talking to our legislators and our decision makers, and our own politicians and the folks who run these departments to make it abundantly clear that that's exactly what this was. And it needs to be treated exactly like that. Let me talk a little bit about our experience. The basic PPE just simply wasn't there. Several days into the incident, we're talking about N95 masks. And I'm told that the Incident Command Center at the Palisades Fire, we've got it covered, no problem. We have plenty of masks available for the firefighters. And I'm saying, well, I'm not seeing anybody using them on the incident whatsoever. Maybe a handful here or there. I saw one PAPR that was being used by a battalion chief at one point. But for the most part, by and large, nobody is using these devices. And I said, well, it's good. We got the N95s. Let's get them in every engine. Let's just start handing them out. How many do we have? And they said, we have 3,000 masks at supply. It's like we have over 6,000 firefighters on the incident right now. The math doesn't add up. A bit of an anecdote on that. There was a big mad scramble by us, Cal OSHA, and other organizations to get those N95s out to the incident. And when we went to one of the state-owned caches, we were told by a nameless organization that those were for the public, not for the firefighters. And I said, the public's not here right now. Those firefighters are. But fortunately, we were able to secure about 17,000 masks. But that should have been thrown into every engine. Firefighters should have been told, just put this thing on. There was a push further on into the incident and a major effort between both CAL FIRE and Cal OSHA to waive medical, to waive a lot of the state, standard requirements to get P100s out there and those APRs. And by the time all of that was settled and done, it was too little too late. Not that it wasn't still important and can provide some protection, but it's just too little too late. Dermal wipes, I'll mention that one really quickly. We talked a little bit about that, dermal exposures. Dermal wipes, we tried to get dermal wipes out on the incident, and we ran into logistical challenge after logistical challenge, just trying to get some basic, common sense solutions implemented on the fires. This was extremely disappointing. I bring these images up because every firefighter I saw, 99.9% of them were not wearing respiratory devices. Every reporter I saw was, right? I mean, we fundamentally understand the need, and yet our first responders are working these incidents for 24-hour, 48-hour shifts, days at a time, without the proper type of protection. This was just, to me, stunning that we're still doing this today. Initial attack versus extended attack. I can see the problem on initial attack, the logistics, trying to get the supplies, trying to get the materials, doing all of that. Part of it is, again, without certified devices, without proper regulation in place, it's not built into the logistics, right? So trying to get those supplies on initial attack, trying to get this implemented is very challenging. I also want to mention it's not just the first responders. I was getting calls from LAPD, California Highway Patrol, a lot of other organizations, utility workers, everybody out there, nobody wearing protective equipment. There are tons of other organizations that are being exposed to all the same things. Maybe not as bad as the firefighters, but they are also not doing decontamination, as was talked about earlier with Clean Cab and other things. And they're also not being provided with the right PPE. Something needs to change. So what are the barriers? Why are we still in 2025 having the same conversations that we had on Los Angeles fires 10 years ago? 10 years ago, we had the exact same conversations. Why are we having these same conversations? So I want to talk about the acceptance, adoption, implementation issues. And one of the things that we do now is try and understand, what are these barriers, whether it's cultural, behavioral, institutional, economic, or regulatory. What are those barriers? Because there's, and the one gentleman said it earlier, thank you all the researchers for doing all the work. It's wonderful we're doing all the work, but a lot of that stuff sits on a shelf and collects dust. Why? Why is that occurring? And so it's this stuff that we struggle with. On the front end of every one of our research projects today, we include behavioral and cultural and other types of assessments, because I want to figure out what that barrier is going to be at the front end to try and overcome those barriers so that we have a product that's actually going to be implemented and used. We want to understand the current understanding of what's happening, training and education. How do they value this? Are they getting training on respiratory devices? Are they getting training? Do the firefighters actually understand all of those substances that we talk about, PFAS, PAH, benzene? Do they understand these things? I'll tell you, by and large, the answer is no. They know carbon monoxide, but by and large, most of these other things they don't know much about. But they do know about cancer, right? And they do know that there's risk. But we have to understand what are their perspectives on PPE. And so we do online surveys. We've surveyed hundreds and hundreds of firefighters nationwide. And then we do individual interviews, because let me tell you, getting somebody face to face or sitting down with them over a Zoom chat and just having a candid conversation. Dr. Stricker has done a lot of this work. Boy, do you get a lot of great information out of the more candid conversations. It's been extremely helpful in understanding the issues. Cultural and behavioral, you see all of this all the time when we talk about the fire service, right? There's that ongoing joke, it's 100 years of tradition unencumbered by progress, right? And we know there's resistance to change. We know there's this machismo that comes along with being a firefighter and in these roles, and this invincibility that happens, especially early career firefighters. We also know that there's peer pressure that occurs when you want to, be the new person and you're wearing clean gear and an N95 mask and all that. And there's peer pressure that comes along with that. And a stigma even within the service of overprotection. But these are the easy answers. We know this. You could pick any device, any type of PPE, and look at its implementation, acceptance, and adoption over its life cycle, and you will see these same patterns repeat over and over again. But it's deeper than that. Dirty PPE is perceived as a mark of experience and toughness, right? That person wearing brand new yellow gear, or I think Canada, you guys wear red, right? So I'll try and be culturally appropriate here. But That brand new, clean, unused looking gear, that's a sign for a lot of firefighters, somebody who has zero experience and not somebody you can count on when things go bad, right? Whether or not that's true, it doesn't matter. That's the perception of that gear. Younger firefighters are less concerned about long-term cancer risk than their more experienced peers. Later on in your career, you start to worry about those things because you've got kids, you've got a mortgage, you've got retirement in your future. You're thinking further down the line. Top-down modeling of behavior is critical. If leadership neglects decontamination, so do their crews. Leadership becomes so critical in this conversation. If leadership shows the importance of doing this, if they put it into the training, if they talk about it, if they demonstrate it themselves, their firefighters will follow suit. One of our other PhD students recently graduated this year, Rodriguez. She says culture prioritizes toughness over protection. This is based on a lot of her work that she did in interviews and surveys. PPE is sometimes stigmatized or met with ridicule, discouraging that adoption. Institutional barriers include things like a lack of enforcement or modeling from leadership. Conflicting guidelines, outdated SOPs. We're not keeping up with modern fires. We know that. And in fact, somebody said we're, generation behind when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And our SOPs often reflect that. And then training deficiencies and a lack of emphasis. We're not actually teaching our firefighters this. In fact, very few firefighters, even in the wellness training that they get, have a substantial conversation about things like behavioral health or cancer risk and occupational exposures and all of those other things. That needs to be much more of a focus so they understand the job that they're doing. Large agencies may provide limited cancer awareness training, which is good, but it's usually a day of wellness during an 8-week academy. One day. It needs to be substantially more than that. We need a much more significant focus on these issues. No standardized national guidelines, at least in the US, tailored toward wildland or WUI firefighting, and many interventions like respirators, dermal wipes, all these things that we talk about, they lack scientific validation, right? And we're working on that. You see a lot of the research that's going on. Everybody's working toward these goals, but a lot of this, we fall into this sort of decision paralysis because we always say, well, we just don't have enough information. In fact, when we started research a few years ago on respiratory protection, one of the pushbacks we got from certain organizations was, well, we don't understand all of the stuff that's in the smoke. And I said, well, we've been studying it for 5 years. And you know what? Every fire is slightly different than the next. Can we just all agree that smoke is bad? Right? And move on. Yeah, smoke studies are still important. And don't get me wrong, but we need to start implementing some common sense measures. 85 and 0.9% of firefighters reported not using any respiratory protection in the United States. Most commonly used device was a cloth mask, followed by N95s, and then SCBAs. And the SCBAs, those are the structure firefighters who are showing up to these incidents on their engine, and they're not going much farther than their engine to do structure defense. Chemical knowledge, highest familiarity, like I mentioned, was with carbon monoxide, very low familiarity with most everything else out there. Interesting though, no significant difference in knowledge between leadership and non-leadership because they've all taken the same training. That training hasn't really changed a whole lot in many respects. Barriers to respiratory use. Now, this is where it becomes real. Impaired breathing. We talked, the gentleman earlier was talking about the heat risk. Yeah, that's why Dr. Orman is looking at core temperatures and skin temperatures and all of those metrics to see, we may be implementing one measure, but causing another risk to the firefighters. We need to be aware of those secondary, concerns. Leadership and non-leadership prioritize different concerns. Leadership is more concerned with equipment size than the younger folks who were more concerned with how the equipment actually looks, right? So there's this appearance, again, the bravado of firefighting that goes along with this. I like to joke and say, the older you get, the less equipment you want to carry. That's why they're more concerned about the size and the durability and all that kind of stuff. Health motivators. I will say though, 75%, reducing cancer risk is cited as the most important motivator for these folks. So again, they are aware of the risks. They need solutions. And we're just not bringing them to them fast enough. Institutional barriers. Firefighters learn safety practices, like I said, by watching their leaders. Many firefighters report lacking knowledge, confidence, or perceived practicality to respiratory use in real-world settings. And if leaders don't use respiratory protection, no one else will either. And like the gentleman again earlier said, once it becomes a burden, once it impairs communications, interferes with your PPE, your visibility, any of one of those things, it's going to get tossed over your shoulder and they're going to move on. So again, like the other gentleman was talking about earlier this morning too, was, the regulations. Can we create, solid regulations and have mandates to wear these devices? And a lot of folks are saying, well, we aren't that close to that right now, right? We have a lot of work we have to do to get this accepted at that level. Top-down modeling has shown that behavior is critical. If leadership neglects decontamination, so do the crews. Leadership has become sort of the central focus on a lot of what we talk about today when it comes to protecting our firefighters and PPE. If it starts there, it simply happens, especially in the younger firefighters. If this is all you know from day one at Academy, that this is the device you put on your face and this is what we do, then that's all you will ever do, right? So if you can start there, that's a very, very important step. Lack of access to key components. If you talk about PAPRs, this is great, but you've got battery packs, you've got filters that need to be changed out. Under these extreme conditions like the LA fires, an N95 mask is going to get clogged. It's going to have all this soot and ash and everything on it in a matter of minutes and becomes unbreathable very, very quickly. And if you're going to have, long-term use on 24-hour shifts, we have to have infrastructure to back up the use of those devices. And if you're sending crews out hiking miles and miles into the brush to fight these fires, how do you logistically handle all of that? We talked about the PPE body types and everything else. These are the logistical constraints that occur. There are economic barriers. I'll say we need a moonshot when it comes to this, right? We need to take this very serious, put the investment in and come up with the devices and a practical solution for our firefighters. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to figure that out, and we don't have the time to waste. Military technology has considerable crossover, but let me tell you, they spend a lot more on the military than they do on our firefighters. And that is a financial barrier to getting this implemented, let alone constraints on volunteer or smaller departments. The regulatory barriers, I'm going to skip ahead, and we've talked a bit about this already, about the regulatory barriers, bureaucracy, cultural resistance, funding silos, all the stuff that we're all familiar with. It's government, okay? We're a bit of a juggernaut and kind of a slow-moving Titanic when it comes to steering. But when we create those regulations, folks like Cal OSHA and Cal Fire and others right now are working to overcome those barriers to shift to mandating usable field-tested gear. We just don't have the answer quite yet, because every time we think we're getting close, something comes up that says, well, there's another barrier to implementation or acceptance or adoption. Not all devices can work in all situations. Not all devices will work in all situations. And that's one of the things we're finding out through a lot of this research. So we need to be a little bit nimble. We need to worry about the trade-offs that occur. If you put on this device, what's going to happen to that firefighter? It's going to impact cardiac or heat stress, mobility, visibility, communications, all of those critical functions of what situational awareness is and how the firefighters get their job done.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Okay, hang on. Almost done. Key point here
seconds.
Is our pursuit of perfection in trying to reach this ultimate solution has been getting in the way of common sense measures. Get those N95s, Matt. We know basic things can happen right now today to help these firefighters out. So let's get stuff implemented that we know will work. But also, and I love this phrase, and I put it up there because I knew Brian was going to say it today, we're not coming down from 95%, we're coming up from 0. So anything we do at this point, even if we say, hey, we're only providing 40% protection because of the devices we've selected, this is still a huge leap forward in what we are doing as an organization and what we're able to provide as far as protection for our firefighters. There's our QR code. A lot of the information we talked about is available online. Shoot us an email or join our mail list. And we're just in the process of publishing a whole lot of studies that we just completed with CAL FIRE over the last 3 years. So a lot of that's going to be put on there momentarily. I appreciate the time and thank everybody for